Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Bennett with Third Way. Thank you for joining us. I see that we still have people streaming in here, so I'm going to wait just a few minutes, which is especially awkward in these Zoom webinars because we sit here staring at you. But a couple of things before we get started. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you've probably done a million of these and know this already, but in the Q&A function, you can type questions, and we encourage you to do so. As you'll see in a moment, we're going to start with a quick presentation from Stephanie, and then we'll have a discussion among the three of us. But what we would like to do is salt in questions from the participants. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of the questions as we can. We have a pretty big turnout for today, so if we don't get your question, forgive us, but please do that. Because all of you are on time, let's go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Matt Bennett with Third Way. We are delighted to be joined by two experts in this incredibly important field of Latino and Hispanic politics. Stephanie Valencia, as most of you probably know, is the founder or co-founder of EquisLabs, and before that served in many capacities in the Obama White House and Obama administration, on the Hill, at Google, and is one of the leading experts on these questions in all of politics. We're also joined by Margie Omero, who has been doing polling for 20 years. She's a principal at the firm of GBAO, and she's had an incredible array of clients and has done some really deep thinking about all the questions around the politics of these two communities. Before we get to the deck that Stephanie's going to present, I want to ask her a question, which I asked in the kind of preview that we were just a little discussion we were having beforehand, which is around terminology. Because I noticed, and you may also, that Stephanie had a really great op-ed in the New York Times, which we will actually send to everybody after this discussion is over. And in the New York Times, the style of the Times uses Latino, Latina, but not Latinx. So Stephanie, tell us how those judgments are getting made and what terminology you recommend.
$1 million question. Thanks, Matt, for asking up front. You know, we have actually researched this question in our polling project, which we'll go deeper in on. And there's still, you know, very different preference state by state. I think there is a very small but vocal group of advocates and other activists who are urging folks to use the term Latinx. You know, for lots of different reasons, you know, we believe in the word Latinx, not because we're asking people to use it, but because we think it actually, the X in Latinx represents the X factor in politics and society that Latinos will play. I would just urge for folks who are running program or who are curious about what to use in their own languaging, Hispanic and Latino are always safe. Hispanic definitely in Florida, Hispanic definitely in New Mexico, but those two interchangeably, you know, work best. But there is just a very small number of folks who actually care to use the word Latinx, and we're not recommending that people necessarily change their lexicon in this moment at this point.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to get to a discussion with both of our panelists, but we're going to start, as I said, with a presentation. One final reminder before we do, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, you can ask questions throughout, and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's go ahead with your presentation, Stephanie.
Cool, thanks. And Eno's going to share here in a second. Thanks, Matt, and everybody for joining. It's nice to see so many familiar faces on the phone or on the Zoom call here, names joining us here today. I am about to go through some slides very, very quickly. So I will say at the top, put your questions in the Q&A and you will have access to this deck after the fact. I'd also encourage you to visit equisresearch.us and to follow us on Twitter, where we regularly release our new research and our analysis. Next slide. So we are EquisLabs and Equis Research are two sister organizations that are basically a research and experimentation hub. Our core goal is to create a better understanding of the Latino electorate and invest in new and innovative approaches to reach and engage them. Our kind of crown jewel project is an 11-state polling project, which I'm going to focus on mostly today, but we have a number of other projects that we work on in the leadership capacity building space for political practitioners and in the digital innovation space that focuses on digital testing, things like WhatsApp, and exploring new tools and disinformation. Next slide. As I mentioned, all of our research can be found at equisresearch.us. We've got the research project. We're working with an 11-state research project working with GBAO, of which Margie's firm is our lead pollster, Global Strategy Group, Latino Decisions, and Target Smart. Over the course of the last year, when we launched our project almost a year ago, last July, we have over 28,000, well, close to 35,000 actually interviews under our belt, which has given us a really important, deep and longitudinal sense of who the Latino electorate is today, who they are, what they care about in 11 different states. So what do I want to talk about today? 3 key points I really want to stress and we'll make here. One is that Democrats must reach new heights in support and turnout among Latino voters in 2020 to win. But let me be super clear, this is more than a 2020 problem. The future of our party depends on this community, and we, to date, and as somebody who's worked in this space for a very long time, we've gone away with a very binary approach to how we've done the work. We've kind of seen Cubans, and then we treat everybody else the same, or pan-Hispanic approach to how we do the work. And we've also looked at Latinos very much as a mobilization audience, and the truth is it's a lot more complicated than this. So today we're going to look at where are we starting with Biden. What is it that we need to learn from the primary, and how much we should be focused about the deep support that Bernie Sanders got. Second, I want to talk about how we should be thinking about Latino voters as we move toward the general election, because any path to 270 includes Latinos, including in the Southwest and places like Arizona and Florida, of course, but also places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so what is it that we need to do, and how should we be thinking about it as we approach the general election? And then lastly is, where do we find these new votes, especially in the new world that we're living in the COVID world that we're living in? It's going to take a both and strategy of registration and targeting non-voting Latino voters in all of these states. And so how do we think about the electorate in a new way to find these new votes? Next slide. So where do we start with Biden and Latinos and the Bernie Biden holdouts? The gist of this slide is super simple. It's stating the obvious. There's deep dislike among Latino voters about Trump. This has stayed very stable over time and has not been volatile. Next slide. So where does this leave Biden room to grow? Despite being vice president for 8 years, a surprising number of people have a neutral or uninformed opinion of Joe Biden. So there is a huge lane and opportunity for him to be reintroducing himself to this community in this moment. Next slide. Here's where we can see the Biden-Trump margin today versus the Clinton-Trump margin before. You can see there is room for Biden to grow his support in the Latino community. There's, again, a huge lane for him to do that. I think our folks are very decidedly anti-Trump, but they're still in a wait and see mode about Joe Biden. Next slide. When we look at the support for a generic Democrat, that we've tested to date, and now we've started to test Biden against Trump specifically, the support for a Democrat against Trump is high, but it's kind of soft, especially among younger voters. And older men are more set in their opinions, but especially younger women and younger men, we have a lot of work to do. Next slide. So one of the questions we asked ourselves coming out of the primaries with the deep support that Bernie had among Latino voters, there's, I think, a lot we can learn about his campaign and the investment that his campaign made. I think a lot of it is replicable. It's not necessarily rocket science. Some of it was obviously about Bernie and his policies, but a lot of it was just about the attention and the investment that they made in the community. That being said, when we think about how worried we should be about the Bernie to Biden holdouts, it turns out not as much. The numbers are actually fairly small in terms of folks who were rated Sanders very favorably in the primary and Biden unfavorably, so it's relatively small. Next slide. So how should we be thinking about Latino voters as we move into the general election? The kind of meta framing, I would say, is more nuance, less binary thinking. It's not just about Cubans and everybody else we can treat the same. There's a lot of nuance that really exists state by state. I'll be talking a lot about, you'll see in all of the slides that we do today, we break everything down by state because it's really critical. Every state is completely different. And so as folks are thinking about Latino strategies, it's important to take that into account. We know that Latinos will matter in every state and every map going to 270, but it requires us to think beyond the kind of traditional mobilization and persuasion frameworks that we have been taught to think about on campaigns and who we are talking to in this community. And we're going to have to expand our view beyond just likely voters. Next slide. This is just an eye-opening slide to show the potential of the Latino vote in many places. This is just a sampling of 4 states that will obviously or could obviously matter in 2020 and beyond. The gray line is the Clinton-Trump margin in 2016. We've got third-party vote share, Latinos that were registered that didn't vote in 2016, and those who were eligible and did not register in 2016. You can see the kind of potential that could be realized if we tap into these different parts of the electorate in places like Arizona, even Michigan and Wisconsin. Next slide. The thing I will also flag about just a grounding piece around the Latino community, while the general electorate is largely, there's a huge break between college and non-college as a factor in support in the broader electorate. That's not necessarily true among Latinos. It's more a factor in terms of engagement and excitement and motivation about participation than it is about support for a Democrat. So that's an important thing to note as we think about outreach and engagement of different kinds of Latino voters. Next slide. So then where do we find these new Latino votes? If we go to the next slide here, there's huge opportunity, as you can see, in all of these different states. When we look at 2020, the blue band, there's plenty of opportunity in registering new voters, but registration alone won't wildly expand the electorate on its own, especially if there's not the kind of follow-up engagement to these voters. The ability of campaigns to organize and register voters in a post-COVID world is obviously going to be very challenging because site-based voter registration is so critical to register Latino voters, and that's not going to necessarily be a viable option at the scale we've seen in the past in the foreseeable future. So that's why campaigns should not sleep on the green band here in the middle, which is the large number of Latino non-voters who have already gone through the trouble of registering to vote, and they're key focal point for universe expansion in this environment. They're already registered, they just need to be communicated with, and oftentimes they have lower voter propensity scores, and so we're not necessarily talking to them regularly on campaigns because they're not necessarily considered likely voters. So we need to, and what's different about these non-voters, and again, than the general electorate, is they tend to be more anti-Trump. And so you can see here, there's a case to be made, again, in the, in targeting this universe of registered non-voters, because in many states, they actually exceed the number of likely voters in 2020. So I think that's really important for us to take into account as well. Next slide. The other thing is we kind of look at moving beyond mobilization frameworks, base mobilization versus persuasion, that's kind of either or on a campaign, and that's how campaigns kind of tend to look at reaching different communities. And Latinos, along with, other voters of color, are often tossed into a mobilization category. But the truth is there's actually a relatively small universe of Latinos in the persuasion category, but I wouldn't exactly put everybody else in the mobilization category either. We've identified what we're calling at Equis a new category of voter called the ambivalent voter, which we define as probably leaning for either side or truly undecided or saying definitively that they want to vote for a third party. And that category is actually fairly large across all 11 states that we poll, anywhere from 28 to 41% of the Latino electorate. So our worry is not that they are going to defect to Trump. We think that he's relatively hit a ceiling of support among Latino voters. But the reality is we're worried that they're actually going to defect to the couch and won't turn out at all. And this is a universe that won't necessarily respond to the GOTV treatments of the last 2 weeks of the election, but need a reintroduction to Joe Biden and an affirmative vision and information about voting. Next slide. Again, this is just a breakdown. Okay. So next we'll talk about gender, which is probably one of the other major findings of our polling project of the last year. This is the largest gender gap that we've identified since the year 2000, as far back as we've tracked it so far. Latinas are deeply, deeply anti-Trump, but their levels of motivation and excitement about participating in the election are still not where they need to be. Many of them also fall into the ambivalent category of voter that I mentioned. Roughly 36% of the Latino ambivalent voters I was talking about are young women. And then let's talk about men for a second. First, not all Latino men are created equal. Younger men also make a huge share of this ambivalent voter cohort. And then I want to just myth bust for a second around a narrative that I've seen kind of churning out there the last few weeks around Trump increasing support among Latino men with an asterisk and discount Florida for a second, but in our other 10 states, certainly from our polling, men are not as anti-Trump as their female counterparts, but they're not necessarily flocking to Trump. He's basically hit a ceiling in their support and is not getting more support among Latino men than his previous successors have. And so I think it's kind of a false narrative that men are flocking to Trump. They're just not necessarily going to Joe Biden or Democrats either. Next slide. So you can see the historic gender gap here as illustrated in this slide going back to the year 2000. Next slide. You can see state by state the way that women are leading the charge in their deep anti-Trump sentiment. Next slide. And this was from our latest set of polling. This continues to grow and is holding really, really steady. But that being said, next slide. You can see here where men are, and if we go here to the next slide, Latinas, while they're at the vanguard of the Trump resistance, they're less motivated than men. And so I think that is just a really important thing for us to identify, is that while women are deeply, deeply anti-Trump, they're not at the levels of motivation and excitement that we might hope that they would be. And next slide, we face a lot of challenges related to the turnout of Latino voters. They do not turn out at the same levels as Black and white women. And so there's a lot of work to do to provide them with the kind of education and support they need to feel prepared to go and vote, especially in this environment where voting will be more complicated than it has been in the past. But we need to ensure that they don't need to feel like they need a PhD in political science to vote. Next slide. So let's just jump quickly through from our latest round of polling about what we know about Joe Biden. A couple of few things to kind of key up at the top. Anti-Trump sentiment is not going to be enough to turn out Latino voters for Joe Biden. As I said earlier, there are large swaths of folks who just do not have a deep sense of who he is, and there's a huge opportunity in which to reintroduce him. Two, there are some interesting lanes around coronavirus and the economy that we really want to make sure that we address, and there's a huge lane for him to have a conversation on. And then we'll talk a little bit about the issue of immigration, which I know you all are interested in as well. So when we look at anti-Trump sentiments, we look at the Biden open end. A lot of what we just see is that the reason they're supporting Joe Biden is because it's the anti-Trump and they dislike Trump. So there's got to be an affirmative vision for folks to support. Next slide. The definitely Biden supporters are more likely to cite Biden's experience. So that's something that we should also think about leaning into. Next slide. And the probably Biden supporters are a little more wishy-washy on him. So again, this shows the opportunity. They just say he's the lesser of two evils. Next slide. And nearly half of respondents who do not plan on voting cite just kind of a lack of faith in the candidates and the process as a reason for participation. So again, there's a huge lane to have a conversation about increasing the faith of Joe Biden among Latino voters. Next slide. Older Latino voters, as we've seen from our latest survey, show that they're more supportive of Biden than younger voters in 8 of 11 states. He's got a lot of work to do with younger Latino voters. You know, the median age of a Latino today in the US is 28 years old. And so again, this is the future of our party and something that cannot be ignored. Next slide. When we look at coronavirus, we see health is popping out as the biggest and more in-depth concern right now. This was from a poll back in May. Things may be shifting as the economy is reopening again, and we want to continue to track this sentiment. But across all of our 11 states, health really pops as the #1 issue. But I will flag next slide that it really does, the intensity of that concern differs by state. So we see in Michigan, health being kind of an outstanding concern, but Nevada, the economy being more of a presiding concern. Next slide. Here you can just see a sense of word cloud around the support of these issues. Next slide. Now, as we shift to other issues, this was pre-coronavirus, so I just want to flag that. You know, the one place where Latino voters pre-coronavirus and pre kind of the moment in this country on race that, you know, Latinos were giving Trump some credit was around the economy. And so that is something we need to continue to watch and monitor as the economy kind of comes back and recovers over the next few months potentially. But we can see he had stellar level, if we can go to the next slide, stellar level approval on his handling of immigration among Latinos, and this was across all Latinos. As we go to the next slide, you can see some of the positive commentary that ambivalent voters said about Trump and the economy, again, pre-coronavirus. But if we go to this last slide here, what are Latino voters and ambivalent Latinos saying about immigration? This is a really important point, I think, as we think about how we communicate about immigration over the coming months in 2 ways. One, Kids in cages and family separation are just a really important piece to communicate to Latino voters, even with conservative Latino voters. We know that the issue of immigration is complicated even in this community, but there was a chord that was struck across the entire Latino electorate with separating families and kids in cages that we should really be paying attention to, being specific about that and not kind of getting lost in the bigger picture kind of policy conversation on comprehensive immigration reform is something that, where we start to lose some folks on that issue. The other thing I will just say is that, it is, Trump, I think, is investing a lot of money and trying to reach Latino voters in places like New Mexico and Nevada, and obviously Florida and Michigan and Wisconsin. We've seen him investing a lot of money to communicate online, specifically with Latino voters. I think the thing that, again, we are not concerned about him increasing support among Latinos. I think his job and what his team is trying to do is muddy the waters enough to create enough doubt about Joe Biden. And I think even on the issue of immigration, that is going to be a place where it will be a challenge where we need to kind of be mindful of how we create a lane for an affirmative communication of who Joe Biden is and what he will do for this community. So I will stop there and turn it to Margie.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Before we get into a discussion, I just want to remind our participants, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions, and we will get to as many of those as we can. Thank you for that incredible presentation. You went through it quickly, of course, because our time's limited, but as you noted, it'll be available for people to look at more carefully after we're done. Margie, let me ask you the question that just overwhelms me every time I think about the politics of this community, which is, if you created, like in a Frankenstein lab, a candidate designed to repel these voters, you would create Donald Trump. And in a moment in which negative partisanship seems to drive the vote in so many other demographic segments, why isn't that happening here? Stephanie, her presentation made clear they don't like Trump, but they're not reacting the way it seems other voters are. What do you think explains that?
Well, I guess I don't know if I would agree. I mean, well, first of all, I love the presentation. I wanted it to keep going. I was just watching it, the whole time. I think that Latino voters behave similarly at some level to voters overall, which is there's a large population, there's a large percentage of the population that says, this is really not for me, this is too much, and they feel very strongly. And because I feel strongly, it doesn't mean that I should expect everyone to feel strongly. So there are Latino voters who are open-minded to Trump and Trump curious, or approve of his positions on the economy the way voters across the demographic spectrum do. We should not expect and hold Latinos to this image of they should be monolithic on Trump, because nobody's monolithic on Trump. I mean, people feel very strongly. Maybe they're monolithic within themselves. They're very consistent internally on how they feel about him. But we shouldn't expect any one group to kind of be the face of consistent Trump opposition in that uniform way. Although I understand what you mean. I mean, to me he's cartoonishly awful in every way. So I can understand the feeling of wanting to know why is he above zero? That's the question that I wake up to every day. Why is his number anywhere north of 1? And that, we'll be discussing this on, panels for a really long time. And, when you talk to people in focus groups, I hear a couple things, and you hear the same thing with Latino voters as you do with African-American voters who are, more centrist on their positions, or suburban white women or non-college men, which is, they feel he has not been able to succeed. The press has been against him. He doesn't necessarily surround himself with the right people. He has good policies, but he is, impulsive, right? There aren't that many people who kind of like the show. Most people think the show is bad and harmful to what they might otherwise be open to in terms of policies. And then another layer of I feel okay about how X is going. And because people don't feel okay about how things are going right now, You have, the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that shows everybody thinks that, the country's out of control. In the Navigator polling that we put out on a weekly basis, Stephanie's part of that effort too. Overwhelmingly people feel we have major crisis, a plurality feel America's in decline. I mean, the numbers are bad across the board.
Stephanie, let me ask you a question. I have a million of them from that presentation, but one slide alarmed me a bit, or one of the slides that alarmed me, was the delta between the voters you surveyed who supported Hillary and those who support Biden. Why do you think that is? Is it just that he's ill-defined and she wasn't? What's driving that gap?
Yeah, certainly. I would say a few things. I think, our data confirms that Biden hasn't consolidated the anti-Trump Latino vote yet. Again, Trump's numbers are stagnant, but Biden's margin is lagging this because of, an underperformance among Dems, which again shows like the need that he needs to look at to really kind of create a lane to reintroduce himself to the Latino community. I think there's a lot of there for him to be able to do that, to create a more affirmative vision for who he is. I think he's a Catholic man of faith. I think he has got a great story. I think that there's a lot on policy that he can be communicating with this community to just get them more excited about who he is. But I would also stress it's not too late for Joe Biden. There are kind of two examples I like to bring up with regard to this. If we look back at the primary in 2008, I was, Barack Obama's deputy Latino vote director and worked with him, through the primary until, through the general election. And Barack Obama did not win the Latino vote in the 2008 primary. We came, when he finally won the nomination, we really, doubled down on investing and engaging the community in a really serious and thoughtful way. And, obviously, some of that was the candidate, some of that was the outreach, but, we were able to, build the largest, support among in this community for presidential candidate with Obama. I will also remind people that Bernie Sanders did not win the Latino vote in 2016, but after a significant amount of investment in thinking about how to reach and engage the Latino community, for the 2020 election, his investment paid off. And so I think that, again, the window is closing, but it is really important to know that it's not too late for Biden to have this conversation with Latino voters and try to bring them over the side. I will say, take a place like Arizona, when we look at older Latinos versus younger Latinos, who are much larger more likely to fall in the ambivalent category than the definite Biden category. So there's a lot of opportunity, especially with younger Latinos. It's going to take a very concerted effort from the campaign to communicate to these younger voters who are in this ambivalent category. But what we saw from the Bernie campaign was where they made major investments. When you look at a place like Nevada versus Colorado, we actually did a case study between Nevada and Colorado during the primary. They spent significantly less resourcing in Colorado, and they spent a lot of resourcing in Nevada to communicate and reach voters at every level: digital, television, candidate time, surrogate time. And you saw the payoff in Nevada. And you also saw less levels of increase of support for Bernie in a place like Colorado. So I think our voters are ready to respond when communicated with. Obviously, the policy and the vision needs to be there as well. But I think there's a lot of, just so much low-hanging fruit that, the campaign can be addressing in the immediate term, but they have to do it soon.
Before I turn back to Margie, one quick note. We've been asked in the chat if this is going to be available. It will. This discussion is being recorded along with Stephanie's presentation of the deck. So that'll be available on our website soon after this is over, and we will email it out to those who are on the phone or on Zoom. Margie, I think the presentation made very clear that Latino and Hispanic voters are anything but a monolith. In fact, they seem incredibly multifaceted and complicated. How should a national campaign like the Biden campaign think about that? I mean, you can't even just divide them by state. Not all Texas Latinos are the same. So how would you go about thinking about how to define Joe Biden for this very complex, heterodox group of voters?
Well, I mean, I think the same way you look at all of America, you know, when you do a statewide poll or a national poll, you're looking at 800, 1,000, 600, depending on the size of your electorate, to then look at all the different subgroups within that state, because, you know, white voters are not a monolith, and, you know, college educated older men are going to be different than younger non-college women who are moms, and so on. And so, you know, the beauty of the Equis project that, you know, I'm very happy that, you know, Michelle Mayorga on our team has been a partner on, is to be able to look at some of these demographic groups, so you can really see how gender plays out, how you know, age plays out, how, you know, country of origin plays out, the amount of, you know, Spanish media that one consumes versus English dominant media. So, I mean, these kinds of factors are, you know, just part of the demographic analysis that should be done with any kind of statewide campaign. And you should do that for all of your, you know, for any kind of statewide effort, and to make sure that we're looking at the right drivers, in addition to figuring out how do people connect to Joe Biden, how are people feeling about the economy. Our navigator work shows the Latino community particularly concerned about the economic and health impact of the coronavirus in a very, very acute way, very much worried about what's happening in their family, whether someone in their family is going to lose a job or whether someone in their family is going to get sick. These kinds of really pressing concerns very much play a role in how people are viewing the president, how people view Joe Biden, his ability to connect to people and talk about their experiences and what's happening in their lives. And so those are the kinds of things that, you know, any kind of campaign should be focusing on.
I would just mention to that, Matt, as well. I totally, you know, I think the national media likes to package up the Latino community in a nice box and kind of make broad swath comparisons. But anybody who does this work knows that, like, it really does matter state to state. And to the person that asked about state parties, you know, all of our research is available through TMC and Rick Palacio for state parties to access it, so that they can, you know, apply this research. It's also public, large swaths of it are publicly available for state parties to pull down from our website. So I encourage people to really kind of do the work and take the kind of peel back the onion on who the Latino community is in their specific state.
So let me start there with you, Stephanie, and another question came in around healthcare. It was one that I was wondering as well. It goes to the point that Margie's made, which is if healthcare is the number one issue for this community, that's interesting because it's the number one issue for everybody. So if you're a campaign, either the Biden campaign or a down ballot candidate, how do you address healthcare in ways that would particularly resonate with the Latino community? Or is it basically the same thing you're saying to the non-college whites or the African Americans or whomever else is part of your coalition?
Yeah, what I will say is that, you know, Latinos, when you look at kind of the survey of issues, you know, healthcare, education, you know, and healthcare specifically, access and quality education, you know, access, affordable college, you know, immigration, obviously children, you know, child separation and family separation and kids in cages kind of being the primary things. I will say, you know, especially among younger Latinos, what we did see in the primary, especially in a place like Texas, was there was, you know, deep support for policies like Medicare for All. I think what that is saying, though, and what Bernie diagnosed with this community was he diagnosed a set of problems that people are feeling every day, which is they don't have good health care and they need it and they want it, or they need affordable health care, need better access to health care. And two, that education is a challenge for them, right? Like what community college, four-year college, you know, work training programs. And so while, you know, I'm not totally sure the exact policy responses that Bernie was putting out there are exactly what Latinos want, they responded to them. And so I think that there is a huge lane, again, for candidates to have a conversation on healthcare, education and immigration with this community. I will also say that for this community, immigration, I think sometimes folks tend to kind of make immigration the issue that we need to talk about with Latino voters. It is a very important issue. I call it kind of the gateway issue for many Latino voters. Like where a candidate stands on immigration very much is how they will view, it's a little bit of a litmus test for them to say, can I trust this person? That being said, it cuts a lot of different ways in this community, but the primary issues of the economy, education, and healthcare are ones that are really critical for any candidate to be communicating with Latino voters about.
Margie, let me ask start with you on this, and maybe Stephanie can weigh in also. It's a really interesting question around when campaigns at all levels communicate with this community. Is there an advantage to invoking cultural heritage? Do you talk to people of Puerto Rican descent, or people of Mexican descent, or people of Brazilian descent? If you have significant percentages of them in your demographic or in your state or congressional district, is that a good idea, or should you shy away from that unless you happen to be a member of that community yourself?
I mean, I think generally people appreciate an effort in someone trying to reach out and connect with your community. I think I would start there with the, what's your goal? And if your goal is to connect with your community and demonstrate, I'm here to learn about your community, and I'm here to as a resource, as a candidate or elected official, I think that's a good foundation. Whether it strikes people as a wrong note if you try to invoke some sort of cultural, I'll leave it to others to say what they think. I'm sure people vary in their perceptions of that.
So we're actually running a digital test right now, looking at different kind of messages that will resonate with different subgroups of Latino voters. So we're testing things like messenger and tone and message, right, to understand. And we're actually doing an online voter registration test in Florida, specifically focusing on Puerto Rican voters, that will start in July, where one of the things we were testing is like, does it matter to have a pan-Hispanic message to the Puerto Rican community about voter registration, or is it important to have like specific Puerto Rican cultural cues in that message? I don't know the answer yet. My hypothesis is that Puerto Rican cultural cues, given it is such a strong part of people's identity in certain places, will be very resonant with certain parts of that community versus like a pan-Hispanic or just a generic voter registration appeal. And so part of what we're trying to understand is, with what voters should we be communicating with a more identity-specific appeal versus like an issue-specific appeal versus a Spanish language appeal? When should that be bilingual? When should it be Spanish first?
I think, there's probably a difference between if you do a test and you're looking at kind of a generic mail piece with cues, or a generic mail piece without those cues, versus a candidate in person or on television trying to make that connection. That's going to be very much dependent on whether that candidate seems authentic and then in making that connection. Other times we've also tested when we've done some work on Get Out the Census, message, and that was across a variety of different communities of color, where we experimented with messaging that was focused on, your community needs to be counted, and a little bit more identity focused versus, something that's more big picture of like, this is what the census does, and it's important, here's what the census is, as opposed to something more political. And the more big picture worked better. Now, this again was kind of high level as opposed to, individual kind of outreach for, Get Out the Census, but it's I think the application is important.
Yeah, and that messaging piece is another set of messages that we are in testing with right now, at least on digital, which is, does a community specific appeal work, or, is it like, and when do we invoke Trump versus just talk about a particular issue, right? Like, when is Trump going to help to increase motivation or excitement or participation levels, versus when should we be talking about it in a broader frame about, the community, access for the community, empowerment for the community, et cetera.
I think all of this are steps forward from kind of the, olden days, where you had a lot of candidates just either translate an ad into Spanish, or had, something like, just about immigration. That those were kind of the two different, like, we're going to just take what we're running everywhere and translate into Spanish, hopefully the translation's good. And then, or something specific about immigration with the assumption, at times not true, that that's the number one issue for all Latinos all over the country.
So let me press that point, because I think what we've seen candidates do in the past is make the mistake of believing that certain demographic cares only about one thing. So we've seen that with, for example, criminal justice reform in the African American community. We've seen it with choice and women in, even in statewide high profile races. We've seen candidates like shove in the whole stack on choice, and women are like, I care about healthcare and the economy also. Are you seeing among your clients or the races you're looking at, and I'll ask both of you, starting with Margie, is that still happening, or are candidates being a little more nuanced about how they treat immigration as it relates to the broader set of issues that these folks care about?
I mean, I think we're all trying to do better. You know, I think the Democratic community is trying to do better on these kinds of things. I think we're all sort of, you know, improving as an ecosystem, you know, year by year, and on a lot of these measures. That doesn't mean that there aren't still candidates who, you know, who fall into, you know, who want to fall into those old grooves of what they think the, you know, the right approach is. And, you know, we've had these conversations with folks even this cycle. But, you know, when I first started in this business, I had candidates who just didn't even want to survey. I had a candidate once not even want to survey people of color. Just, he's like, they're all going to vote for me. I don't need to spend the time even surveying communities of color. So that's, you know, that's what it was like sort of in the beginning of you know, polling, when campaigns weren't, you know, weren't really quite sure how to use polling. So I think we've come farther since then.
Yeah, a big piece of our work, in addition to kind of the output of the analysis that we do and how that shapes the way that we really want to shift the way that the progressive and democratic establishment thinks about this community, because we're getting bigger, not smaller. Like that is just a matter of fact. The future of the Democratic Party will largely depend on whether we can engage these voters. And I will go out on a limb to say that, like, I think like this will be the new white swing voter for this community over the next, for our Democratic and progressive community, because it is that complicated and nuanced. And so I think that, you know, part of what we're trying to also do is identify different modes of polling. You know, Margie's firm is helping us to do this, which is when we look across all of the different states that we're polling in, where are we seeing different kind of responses versus online versus phone versus landline versus cell phone? What does that mean to how we think about public opinion and gathering public opinion from this community moving forward? I know that the kind of entire polling ecosystem is kind of going through a renaissance right now, especially in this moment in time, of how we continue to capture accurately public opinion. But this, you know, how do we do that with the lens within this community, and what are the things we need to take? So that's something that, you know, in addition to the digital work that we're doing and identifying best practices and how to reach folks online, you know, one big takeaway we want to, you know, help folks understand is how do we gather public opinion from this community in a more nuanced way as well.
We have only a couple minutes left. I want to ask both of you to reflect on this. To your point, where do you think that the broader Latino Hispanic community is trending the way that, let's say, the white ethnic community did in the 50s and 60s, which is that as they became, you know, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh generation, they you know, some of the non-college folks trended to the right, and college educated tended left. Do you think that's kind of where we're headed with families that have been here longer, or do you think young Latino voters are doing something different?
I think that this is a big question for Equis longer term, and why it's really important that Equis have this longitudinal view of the electorate, not just this election cycle, but beyond, and really going beyond, you know, the current cycle we're in now, looking back as far back as we can find research and analysis on the Latino community to see how trends are evolving over time. This question of Latino identity and what it means to political participation and civic participation is really, really critical for us to unpack. I don't have the answer to your question, Matt. Like, it is something that is part of why we started Equis, was to understand, like, as the population grows, as we become more assimilated, more, you know, intermarrying with other races, you know, like in ethnicities, like how does the issue of Latino identity shift and change as it relates to people's civic participation? And what does that mean for how we communicate with this group, not as a block, but as, you know, kind of you know, subgroups across different states, and what is it that we need to continue to trend? One thing I will say is, you know, a note about the population broadly is that US population growth in this country, or the Latino population growth in this country, is being driven by US born Latinos. It is not immigration. And so I think that is something that's really important. You're seeing a lot of, especially in the places of the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, even Pennsylvania is more of like a Puerto Rican population, but in a place like North Carolina, over the last 20 years, you've seen a large growth of the Latino community. It's largely been driven by immigration and the undocumented population. What you're seeing now is that the people who are now of voting age are those immigrants' children, and they are US citizens. And so what we are seeing is those folks are largely more progressive. They have a direct line to the issue of immigration because their parents perhaps are undocumented or they're first generation immigrants themselves. Or they have members of their family who are undocumented. And so that is something that we really have to kind of take into account as we look at this community as where the population growth is being driven from. Because again, those are US born Latinos, but they are people who have a direct tie to the immigration experience themselves.
Margie, any final reflections? This has been incredibly helpful and insightful. And I know that your firm is going to continue to do a lot of work on this. If I were a candidate and one of your clients, is there any kind of broad advice you could offer, particularly for people who are running in places that don't have gigantic populations of Latinos and Hispanics, but they're an important part of the electorate?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple things. I mean, first, this question of like, what is next? What's the evolution of Latino political engagement and democratic performance? I mean, it's up to us, but it's also, there's parts of it that are out of our Democratic family's control, and that's what happens the Republican Party. And that was certainly, there was a moment where it seemed like the Republican Party was trying to change the direction of where Latino participation was headed in a real, noticeable way. And you saw Republican advisors say, after Romney's loss, like, no one's going to try this again. Like, this is the last time we're going to try to run up the score with white voters and not worry about what happens in communities of color. Someone said that, on like not for attribution after Romney, that turned out to be wrong. They obviously have, taken a different approach. And so that's, so that's obviously part of this too. And I think what we'll see after what happens after 2020 is going to, play a big role in that. So that's the first thing. I mean, I would say as far as like what candidates should do is, I think candidates should approach all their voters with kind of the same open-mindedness and open ear to what their voters are going through and what their constituents or potential voters are going through. And that not everybody's experiences are the same, and not everybody's experiences within the community are the same, and that not all communities of color are the same. We spend a lot of time as progressives talking about Black and brown voters, and that includes all kinds of different people with all kinds of different backgrounds. And the Navigator work that's been released this week shows actually some differences between African Americans and Latinx voters. We did over samples of both on issues of police and on issues and their trust and interest and support for police, for among other things, but very similar worries and fears about what's happening at with COVID and the economy and what it means for them. So I think all those things are important. Anybody running for office should really be trying to put themselves in the shoes of all the voters that everyone they want to represent.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing. I know we're at time, but to a question that somebody answered about Senate candidates, I think the same thing is true for Joe Biden as it is for many Senate candidates. In some states, Joe Biden is underperforming where our Senate candidates are. But what I will say is neither Joe Biden or any of our Senate candidates are at the levels they need to be with Latino voters to win. Like Mark Kelly is nowhere where he needs to be in Arizona today to win Arizona, nor is Joe Biden, at least with the Latino community. They're going to have to reach, 69, 70 plus percentage points with Latino voters in a place like Arizona, cinema level support. So, that is, they need to reach out early. They need to be introducing themselves early. They need to be building a relationship with the community early on, because this, as we've seen from our polling, like the last 2-week push of mobilization push, like is not going to get these folks necessarily, off the couch. And I think what Trump's goal is, again, is not to win the Latino vote or to try to win the Latino vote, but he's going to peel enough off the margins, or he could peel enough off the margins by simply muddying the waters and encouraging people to just not vote at all.
it is impossible to overstate how important this is to our politics and to our future. And so I can't thank you enough, Margie and Stephanie. As I said, this will be available online soon. We will send it out to you, and we hope that you'll come back and do this again, because this has been great. Thanks so much. And thank to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.